Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome back to the show Alex Rosado. Alex, I know you're kind of a veteran. You've been on here many times, but for the sake of those meeting you for the first time, take a moment just to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Alex Rosado. I am a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society, a nonprofit organization within Washington, D.C., and I am also on the writer's track for Young Voices.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you penned for realclearpolitics.com. Artifice of the Deal, Harris Politics of Joy ends in tears. Is this kind of a post-election breakdown of what happened for the Harris campaign?
Yes, it would be accurate to describe it as an analysis, but also this is a rude awakening for an administration that has been asleep at the wheel for the last 4 years. And Trump was right to call Joe Biden Sleepy Joe, because really they've been asleep every step of the way. And you want to know why that is because voters have gone to the polls. They voted for the actual change, not the one that Kamala Harris was going to continue. And voters voted on the national economy. They saw that inflation was still a very big problem in America, especially with grocery prices, especially in gas prices in 2022. And what the Kamala campaign didn't understand going in is that even though they had 107 days to prove their case, voters aren't as nearsighted as they think. They remember that economic hardship going back to the inflation days when it was at 9.1% at its peak. They remember when gas prices were $4 a gallon and making sure that the quality of life had to be ensured some way. Crime rates as well, taking a look at major cities, especially in the light that the FBI had some little bit of disorienting crime statistics, especially within major cities like New York, Boston, New Orleans. They went back and silently revised it, but people paid attention. They saw it. They didn't like what they were seeing from the incumbency, and they decided to vote for something else.
I like the word that you use in this article about distracting the Americans. There were a lot of distractions that were utilized in the Harris campaign. Let's talk about what some of those look like and why didn't they work?
Well, first, celebrities were a very big portion of why the Harris campaign had this artificial energy around it. And with the backing of Hollywood, that means big money, but that doesn't mean big results. You had in Atlanta, Megan Thee Stallion go up on stage for essentially a free concert, and then Kamala came out and gave a 10-minute pre-scripted speech and leave. And that was something that was at the very start of the campaign back when she joined in August, but it was a repeating and recurring pattern for all of her campaign stops. You had even people like Taylor Swift endorse Kamala Harris after the first debate, and people were getting very excited over it, had a little bit of cash, had a little bit of voter registration come in right after that. But all of that energy fizzled out because it wasn't actual policy. And I use the word in the article pseudo festivals because in a sense, people were there for a free concert to enjoy the vibes and, have a good time for the time being. But then once that's over, what are you left with? It's just noise. People want actual results. And unfortunately, the people in the ivory towers in Hollywood aren't able to do that for the average American and the electorate at large. People sought something else. They didn't want to be distracted. They wanted answers.
Alex, something else that you point out is that it took a long time for the Harris campaign to actually get something substantive in front of the public as far as their own policies. And I think nowhere was that more noticeable than in some of the interviews that she granted. Talk to me about your impression of the media interviews and how they were conducted and how that either hurt or helped her.
Well, if there's one analysis that voters and viewers should take away from this election is media matters. And especially among the youth that are so politically engaged with media in particular. There were street interviews. Even on MSNBC, they admitted that young voters, one of the deciding factors for them breaking for Trump in the margins that they did was that Trump went on the Joe Rogan podcast, one of the largest podcasts within the nation. I believe it's still number one. And not only did he sit down for an unfiltered 3.5-hour interview to explain to voters his pitch, why he should be reelected, but also J.D. Vance, the vice presidential elect now, went on as well, just to supplement it. Kamala Harris avoided the media and avoided the accountability. And when she did go on, she played on her home turf. That's why she was essentially staying on Call Her Daddy podcast, which is a still bizarre sentence to say out loud, that she was just playing it safe, talking to women voters and courting their vote, which, yes, she ended up obtaining, which is a win in her book. But she ended up ostracizing everybody else in the process. And if you take a look at those exit polls of the post-election analysis, you can see that data in droves.
And what about her message? Because really, when it came down to offering, okay, here's what I'm going to do about the problems that the voters are most concerned about, I don't remember the voters being most concerned about whether Orange Man bad or was a fascist or a dictator. That really didn't seem to drive a lot of what the voters were expressing as far as concern. You mentioned, everything costs more. We're concerned about, our the stability of our economy and the stability of our jobs and so forth. And it seems like she never really went there.
Well, this rhetoric, unfortunately, of painting the Republicans as Nazis and fascists predates Kamala Harris's entry into the campaign. You had a New Republic, the news organization and article, come out, especially on their cover, painting Trump with a Hitler mustache, saying America's fascism. This is something that has been sanctioned, unfortunately, by many outlets and even at parts within the Democratic Party. You saw Tim Walz, right before Trump had his Madison Square Garden rally, say that this was a comparison and homage to the 1930s Nazi gathering at Madison Square Garden. That could not be farther from the truth. And you have people in the media as well. Joy Reid was one of them on MSNBC, calling the Trump camp a fascist camp and a dictator camp. And even Joe Biden supplemented that as well in late October, calling Trump supporters garbage. Well, the actual joy didn't lie on the Democratic side. It was the Republican response to those comments that made Republicans and independents very enthused. Trump took that opportunity to spin the narrative. He hopped in a garbage truck in Wisconsin in Green Bay and started driving around and saying, I'm just like you. This is what they think of us. We're going to build a coalition the way that it was intended to be, with people from every working class background, no matter your gender, your sex, other types of nationalities. We are something that is going to represent you and your interests. And that's something that Kamala could not do.
Wow. That's a great explanation, by the way. I think back to the idea of, the word joy. It's like there came a day where suddenly, hey, this is the campaign of joy, and suddenly every news outlet was using, look at the joy, the absolute joy here. And yet, Alex, it's one of those things where if you have to tell people how joyful you are, it's kind of like a car salesman having to tell you how honest he is. It seems to, if you have to tell people, there's probably something not quite right.
And that's why the article is called Artifice of the Deal, because it wasn't real. It was all fabricated overnight, just like the Kamala Harris campaign and her entry into the race by taking Joe Biden out. And people saw that background and prelude as saying, well, what's going on with Joe Biden? You heard the murmurings that the Obamas were involved, Nancy Pelosi was involved, high-ranking Democratic officials, even fundraisers like George Clooney, who were singing his praises a week later saying he's got to go. Well, that was out in the public for everybody to see, and that really affected people's opinions of the establishment of the Democratic Party. So taking out one candidate, swapping it in for another, that didn't solve the qualms that people had. In fact, I think it only exacerbated them. So what you saw with the joy was a desperate attempt by the media, by the Democratic establishment, to not brand Kamala Harris, but rebrand themselves, rebrand their past mistakes. And unfortunately for them, people didn't buy it. People saw that this was something that didn't represent them. They wanted change, and as much quote-unquote joy as the Kamala Harris campaign could have brought them, they found more and actual joy within the Trump campaign and him riding around in that garbage truck than Kamala could get at her rallies.
Again, we are talking with Alex Rosado. He is a Young Voices contributor. What is your social media?
You can follow me on Twitter/X at Alex P. Rosado.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome back to the program Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. Aaron, it is good to see you once again. For those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment to give us a little bit of your background and tell us about who you are.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Aaron Pomerantz. I'm a social psychologist, and I'm a researcher at Rice University, where I study leadership and specifically how leadership can go wrong and how things like culture and ideology can make that happen.
Well, and to that end, we have an article of yours to discuss about how Western leaders must abandon cultural imperialism in Middle East policy. I have to ask you, as you sat down to write this, did that feel like a fairly weighty task, given the nature of the conflicts that have been going on there for so long?
Yeah, I mean, to try to solve anything with the Middle East, you have to recognize that you're wading into not just a different culture, but a historical context that is thousands of years old. So it is, and any op-ed or even actual research projects dealing with that area, there's a lot of weight. There is a lot of weight. You're not wrong.
So set the stage for us. A lot has happened in the last year or so. I mean, there was the October 7th, 2023 attack against Israel, which in turn spawned a lot of consequences. This has been a pretty pivotal year in terms of Israel's response. Catch us up, if you would, on what has happened in terms of Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran.
Well, as of today, it's actually looking like Hezbollah and Israel might reach a ceasefire, but that's partially because of this ongoing pattern since October 7th, 2023, of Western leaders always leaning on Israel to essentially saying, don't escalate the situation. Don't escalate the situation. Make sure your response is proportional. Meanwhile, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas, all of whom are Iranian proxies, they just keep upping the ante. And Iran itself is upping the ante, from actively encouraging and funding protests on U.S. campuses to trying to assassinate President Trump. It seems that they are not really interested in not escalating. They really want to escalate, but we keep hearing this chorus from Western politicians, even during the election season. It became an election issue for America. Should Israel, quote unquote, escalate or not? And so now it looks like there may be something coming. And what that something is, I honestly don't know. But Iran's window is closing, I suspect. With the new regime coming in January, I suspect that we are at a lynch point, or a crux, or whatever you want to call it, for the Iranian-Israeli conflict's future.
Is it too soon to assume that Israel has accomplished much of what it set out to do in terms of weakening Hamas and Hezbollah and basically putting Iran in a position where it cannot effectively fight a proxy war against Israel?
I don't think Israel has accomplished that yet. And I think that you talk about weighty matters. There's so much we could talk about with this, but the 1,000-foot view would be weakening Hamas doesn't seem to work. They need to be gone. You also have the problem in the West Bank of the PLO, who are also still having pay for slay. They're still being a part of the problem. And you have Iran. Yes, they are being attacked. Israel revealed that they did, in fact, take out some of Iran's undeclared nuclear facilities. But then every time Israel does something like that, there's generally a Western reaction, often an American one, most recently not, because the International Criminal Court's declaration of genocide was roundly rebutted by President Biden, as well as other countries like Czechia. But generally, there was still a Western response saying, oh, no, Israel did a bad thing. And I think that emboldens Iran. So until Western leaders stop sticking their noses into this and looking at it as if they understand what's going on, I don't think Israel can accomplish what it wants to accomplish, because it needs to put Iran in a situation where they know, if you keep trying to kill our citizens, we're going to kill you. And that sounds really, really cold-hearted, but that is what war is. The goal of this is war. And as Israel has shown a lot the last several months, Israel is patient, they are cunning, and they're very, very targeted. And they can hit Iran in relatively targeted ways, such as when they took out Hamas leadership in Iran. So there could be a lot more coming.
Talk to me about the difference between a dignity culture and a culture of honor. You mentioned this as being one of the kind of the sticking points where Western leaders may be misstepping in trying to counsel Israel. Here's how you need to adjust this, but they're approaching it from some very different viewpoints. Help me understand those different cultures.
Yeah, so this is an idea that comes from social psychology, cultural psychology, anthropology, and the idea is that cultures have these central views that everything else is organized around. We call it a cultural logic. A dignity culture, your typical Western culture, the central part of the logic is innate human value, and this is a form of culture that tends to emerge in a post-Enlightenment world. It's associated with things like liberal ideals, free market. One of the phrases that's used is self-interest rightly understood, to quote Tocqueville. An honor culture, however, worth is based on your reputation. And unlike innate worth, your reputation can be taken away from you. If somebody insults you or threatens you and you let them get away with that, you've just lost all your social value. So whereas in a dignity culture, if somebody threatens you, you can say, I don't care. Like, what matters here is that humans are humans, and we can rationally talk these things through. We don't want to cross the line. I believe everyone has innate worth. In an honor culture, it goes, oh, if you insult me and I don't respond, you may try to kill me next, because that's what I've signaled to you by not responding. And one of the examples I use in the piece that I think really illustrates this in the context of war is in World War I, very famously during the Christmas truce. The French, the Germans, the English, I believe the Belgians, they all came together and played soccer or football as they'd call it, over a Christmas truce. They sang carols because at the end of the day, they recognized this idea that they were all human. World War I was a tragedy, and it wasn't about the men fighting it. They did not personalize their national identities in that same way, right? They could come together as humans. That's not at play in a lot of the dynamics here. Now, I'm not saying that there cannot be coexistence. You'll never hear me say that. Their coexistence is possible. But with the war going on, the idea that you can just take Hamas leadership and put them in a room with Israeli leadership and that they're going to have anything but contempt, hatred, and a desire to kill each other as if they're going to have that form of Christmas truce, that's just naive. Because right now, what Hamas and Iran are looking for is, how much can we get away with? And their goal is to just keep attacking Israel because they view the very existence of Israel as a threat, as an insult. And they've said this quite explicitly.
Does Israel hold to that honor point of view, or are they more of a dignity point of view?
I think they live in a very interesting liminal space between them. The majority of Jews in Israel are Middle Eastern in origin. They're Mizrahim, and they do come from an honor ethic. But there is an idea in Judaism of innate worth and innate value that I do think kind of makes that there's a little bit more of a contrast. And I think that's a part of the reason why Israel's kind of in the situation it's in, because Israel can speak both languages of honor and dignity. So you have people in the West saying, well, you're like us. You should be following our norms, our dignity norms. And that's what you should be doing because you're a dignity culture like us. But Israel exists in an honor context and understands those norms and sometimes has to employ them.
Interesting. I've never really considered it from that viewpoint, but that opens up a whole new dimension of how to analyze this. And when you were describing the whole honor culture, I'm seeing shades of that in how the average American street gang member responds when someone disrespects them. Absolutely. It's called code of, one of the terms is called code of the street, but it's just a form of honor culture. It's that's actually the major topic I've studied for most of my career, and it is absolutely the same thing. Same thing as fighting duels, like in Hamilton the musical. It's all a part of that same broader cultural logic. Again, we are talking with Aaron Pomerantz. That's Dr. Aaron Pomerantz. Aaron, I really appreciate this conversation. I learned something today. Thank you. How can people follow you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at pompom9211.
Very good. I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Me as well. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome a familiar voice back to the program. David McGarry joins us. David, for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment to tell us about who you are.
Thank you so much. I am a policy analyst with the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. I am also a writer and speaker and other things emeritus with Young Voices, so I'm very happy to be back on the program.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've talked, but we've got a great subject to discuss, and that is how age verification laws are dangerous and invasive. And the first question I have to ask is, okay, what exactly are we verifying age for, or is this just across the board?
This is more or less across the board, but let me back up for a second. So there are a lot of people on the conservative side of the aisle, or even people in libertarian land, who have been getting somewhat worried about the effects of the internet and particularly social media on children. Mm-hmm. There has been some research on this front. It has also been contested strongly on many points. But I think everyone knows that the internet has many spaces that are fit for adults and unfit for children, especially young children. There also seems particularly to be a harmful effect of social media on both children who are predisposed to mental illness and also specifically on the cohort of girls around ages 11 to 13. So from a public policy perspective, many people, again, in conservative and libertarian circles have jumped in to try to solve this with age verification laws. And basically the way that these would work and the ways that these do work for those jurisdictions that have enacted them is that all users of all ages to usually either upload some kind of government documentation like a scan of an ID or scan their faces in order to demonstrate that they are above some cutoff age. Again, often 13, often 16. And then depending on the law, people who fall below that age will either not be allowed on the social media platform at all or will be allowed only with parental consent, which then can require parents to also submit to some kind of identity verification as well. So my basic argument around these is that, number one, they're unconstitutional because of the ways that they burden speech. But to back up for a second, I would just like to ask what conservatives and libertarians think that gatekeeping online speech on these platforms. So let's be honest, that's what's going on. Who among us thinks that gatekeeping access to speaking online with a regime that will only allow adults to speak after presenting basic government documents or submitting to a facial scan? Who thinks that is a good idea?
When you put it that way, yeah.
Well, especially when, and again, see if this rings any bells from the last few years, the system is based off of dubious and highly contested research from a small cadre of very motivated so-called experts in the field.
Yeah. Your point is actually very well made. And now let me push back just gently on this though. What about those people who say, so are we just saying it's a free for all out there? Is it every man for himself when it comes to protecting kids from content or from influences that we really wouldn't want them exposed to? I guess what is there a way to approach that without the age verification system?
So it's certainly not a free-for-all, and I'm glad you asked the question because I think this is one of the great myths of the internet at this point. Actually, there was a Senate hearing at which a bunch of big tech CEOs testified. Some people might know this is the hearing which Mark Zuckerberg was sort of strong-armed into getting up and turning around and apologizing to the audience behind him. And at this hearing, Ted Cruz said something to the effect of, every parent I know is terrified and out of their mind about the effects that the internet and social media are having on their kids. To which I said, no, they're not. There's actually a tremendous panoply of age verification, or excuse me, not age verification, of child safety tools that have been offered by private businesses. And this goes everything. This can filter content on routers. This can filter content on the device level on phones. Apple has a whole suite of parental controls. And this isn't even getting to the third-party services or to the restrictions that you can put on individual apps. And I will also go one step further and say, I think the tech companies should certainly continue to strengthen these tools and actually to offer more of them. I think the more that parents are able to control their, or at least manage their children's digital lives, the better. And also one other thing I'll add is that especially again, I'm hammering the op-ed that I recently wrote on this topic. Really hammered this from a conservative or libertarian perspective. Where is the parental responsibility? Why is it the government's obligation to not only protect children online, but to parent children online? Where's the government's obligation to baby parents and to make choices for parents? There is a great decision, there's a great quote from a Supreme Court decision, and this was written by Antonin Scalia, and he basically differentiated between government attempts to help parents parent more and better in the ways that they see fit, and government's attempts to impose its own will and its own opinions onto families.
Okay. No, I appreciate that you're making the case there's a better way to do this, because the way that you're presenting this, it's coming into my mind that, the path of least resistance is the one that says, well, let's get government to enforce this or enforce that. But rarely do people stop and think about, well, what might be the unintended consequences? I see you making a very strong case that the unintended consequences may actually outweigh whatever good they hope to do by implementing those age verification policies in the first place.
Precisely. Besides the weird, creepy celebrity side of things, there's the question, do we want all of this data that would be required to do this kind of mass age verification out there in databases concentrated in so-called honeypots that hackers can come and take? Will it really make kids safer to have a lot of their personal information and the personal information of their parents more or less offered up on a golden platter for nefarious actors to come and access? I say no, personally. And I will also add to that there's a lot of junk science about the psychological effects of social media on young people, and there's also a lot of junk talking points about age verification systems. And to this point, we still don't have age verification systems that are protective of data and are also accurate. And that is a huge, and I would argue from a First Amendment perspective, when you're looking at the burdens the government can place on speech, it is an insurmountable obstacle.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in your article, I think it's a quote from Justice John Paul Stevens, talking about anonymity being a shield from the tyranny of the majority. And look, I'm bugged sometimes when people anonymously just snipe online and they believe so strongly in something, but they won't put their name to it. But I sure don't want to tell government, yeah, you should require them. There should be some kind of a penalty if you don't put your name to it. I want to live in an honorable enough society where somebody says, if I believe something strong enough, I will put my name on it. And, those are the people who I know have skin in the game. The ones who don't, I reserve the right to say, well, when you believe in it enough to put your name on it, maybe I'll take you seriously.
That's precisely right. Something that we have to remember is, besides the Stevens quote, there's a great concurrence in that decision called McIntyre versus Ohio Elections Commission by Justice Clarence Thomas. And Thomas goes through the history as he's wont to do. And he finds that indeed anonymous speech is part of the bundle of speech rights that are protected by the First Amendment. Go back, read Publius, or alternatively read Brutus and Cato and the Federal Farmer and whatnot. But we have a long tradition in this country of anonymous speech, and it certainly isn't time to break it, in my view.
Hear, hear. So we've got about 1 minute here. Anything that you would encourage, particularly parents, to keep their eyes on regarding policy proposals in this direction? Are there still serious pushes toward these age verification policies, or have the people pushing that backed off somewhat?
No, these policies are definitely being pushed, particularly at the state level. There are other very problematic, from a civil liberties perspective, very problematic proposals that are going on Capitol Hill. I would simply urge parents to look past the headlines, look past the fear-mongering, and look at what these policies would actually do, and look at the bureaucracies and the regulatory structures that they would actually erect that could either threaten speech or other civil liberties. Okay,
once again, we are speaking with David McGarry. David is a longtime contributor to Young Voices, and he is also a policy analyst at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. David, for people who wish to follow you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
Find me on Twitter, which shall never be called X, at David B. McGarry, and you'll find all of my work there.
Okay. Happy holidays to you if I don't see you before then.
Thanks so much, Brian. Take care.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. And again, I'm happy to welcome back to the program a familiar voice. That would be Gary Frankel. Gary, good to see you once again.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
So I'm familiar with who you are. We've talked quite a few times on this program, but for people meeting you for the first time, give us a little introduction as to who you are.
Yeah, certainly. I'm a doctoral researcher in education policy and American political culture at Texas A&M University. On the academic side, I work a lot in arts, humanities, and civics education, as well as the history and practice of school choice. And I also write a lot of public commentary about education policy and just things happening in American politics.
Well, it's been a pretty eventful year. I don't know if you noticed, but no, with Trump's election and with him preparing to come into office, I know education is going to be one of those huge front and center issues. And I think if I heard him correctly, is he not talking about essentially eliminating the Department of Education? And does that mean getting the federal government out of the business of education, or is it a euphemism for something else?
Yeah, the problem is that nobody really knows, because when you say the term abolish the Department of Education, which Trump and a lot of the people around him have done several times, it can mean one of three things. It can mean A, just getting rid of the Department of Education and all federal responsibility in education entirely. Two, it can mean essentially just trimming off some of the fat and moving some of the functions of the Department of Education that are considered essential to other government agencies and maybe just getting rid of a few staff. Or third, it's a complete takeover and reorganization of the Department of Education to the point where its policies, its missions, and its responsibilities are completely unrecognizable. Nobody really knows what the Trump administration is going to do yet, but from everything I'm seeing and hearing, it seems like that third option is the most likely.
Well, that's disappointing. And I say that as someone, my wife is a public school teacher, and but I want to see that control return to the local level. And this is actually the article we're looking at from the Houston Chronicle that you wrote about how Trump should leave education to local control. And I kind of had hopes when I heard abolish the Department of Education that maybe he meant finally, get the feds out of it. But it sounds like there's some wiggle room that remains.
For sure. Personally speaking, I'm extremely sympathetic to arguments to abolish the Department of Education, but for completely different reasons than the ones thrown around a lot. The Department of Education at the federal level doesn't really do what people think it does. It can't mandate curriculum. It can bribe you to accept a certain curriculum, which is what they did with Common Core, but it can't mandate a particular curriculum. It can mandate certain standards, but those standards are going to be created at the state level. A lot of conservatives in the education policy world joke that the Department of Education is a glorified grant distributor. And pretty often, those grants can be used in the pursuit of silly things. But a lot of the silliness that you see in education is coming from the state and local level. And the real problem with the Department of Education is that it's inefficient. What the Trump administration seems to want to do is to abolish the name, the Department of Education, but perhaps create a similar educational bureaucracy at the federal level in order to fight the culture war. My argument in that article is that the Trump administration should leave that alone, and not to say that the culture war isn't important, but that it should be fought at the state and local level where the government is going to be more aware of what people within those types of communities really think.
Some people might call foul for me using this comparison, but one of the reasons that Roe v. Wade was such an intensely divisive decision was because it imposed a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think the very same principle would apply here. Even if we're talking about, bringing school prayer, back or teaching kids to love America and to appreciate the basic civics, if it's a one-size-fits-all solution, I worry that it's going to be a catalyst for another bloody battle that will last for who knows how many years.
Exactly. And another problem is that even if you do a complete restructuring, a complete reorganization, in order to redirect the Department of Education, or whatever its successor or its replacement is going to be called, towards nationwide culture war battles. Well, this is America. You're inevitably going to lose an election again. What happens when the people who you don't like or have values that are diametrically opposed to yours or substantially different to yours? What happens when they gain access to some of these new levers of federal power that you create? The better answer is to deconstruct the abilities that the federal government has in order to impose its will on the states one way or another, generally through bribery and various mandates in education, rather than just simply saying, okay, this is our bureaucracy now.
No, that's a good point. And it's one that sadly many people don't learn until that shoe is on the other foot. What about school choice? I'm curious if school choice plays into this, it figures into this situation at all. And if so, how would abolishing the Department of Education, even if it's creating a new federal bureaucracy, would it just be basically taking the albatross off from around your neck and putting a millstone on instead?
There's been a lot of proposals at the federal level to enact some sort of federal school choice over the past several years, generally in the form of some kind of tax credit for people that are exercising some kind of choice option at the federal level. My objection to the federal government getting involved in school choice is not philosophical. I'm all for school choice. The problem is that school choice is better conducted at the state level, where state governments have a better idea of how the various mechanics of their state's education system actually work. Because even though there are a lot of similarities in education systems across the 50 states, there are very key differences. And one choice program may not work the same way as it will in another state. And if the federal government runs roughshod over all of those policies, that can create some unexpected problems down the line. So, I think we need to be really careful about how we approach things in education, because with any sort of policy, there are going to be winners and losers, but we always want to minimize the losers.
No, that makes perfect sense. So who are the people who will be at the forefront of making these kinds of decisions? I mean, McMahon, I'm sorry, I forget her first name. She's been McMahon. Yeah, she's been tapped to lead the Department of Education. Are there other figures that we ought to be keeping our eyes on as far as who might be helping to shape these policy decisions?
And something that's really interesting is that nobody really knows yet. Betsy DeVos, Trump's previous education secretary, could still be involved. You might see some of the think tanks and various activist groups being involved, but there's still a lot of uncertainty as far as who is going to play a central role in K-12 education, especially since the McMahon pick is more about higher education than it is K-12.
Wow. So it sounds to me like this would not be a good time for parents or others who are concerned about the direction of education. This is not a time to sit back and go, well, Trump won, everything is settled. It sounds like, if anything, we have some pretty serious navigating to do now.
Yeah, there's so much uncertainty and so many reasons to be cautious that parents need to be very aware of what's happening and where, in order for them to get into the best possible situation for their children.
And by leaving those decisions as much as possible to the local and state level, just again for the sake of those who are wondering, what's the benefit to that?
The states and communities are much more aware of who the people are, how they live, what sort of unique circumstances are involved with them, and they can craft policies in order to take those into account. The federal government just can't do that on a logistical basis. It's impossible.
Again, we are talking with Gary and Frankel. Gary, it is wonderful to catch up with you once again. And for those who would like to follow you, as I do, on social media, what's the best way to track you down?
I'm most active on Twitter at FRANKELGARION.
All right, great to talk with you. Looking forward to our next conversation, my friend.
Likewise. Thanks for having me back.